We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for? Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And today we're going to talk not about the United States, but about Panama, which relates very directly to our ability to control our own border. Panama, as those of you who remember from geography class, is a tiny, relatively narrow isthmus that connects North and South America. And on top of that, the eastern part of Panama, where it borders Colombia, basically overlapping the area where Colombia, basically North and South America meet, the Colombia-Panama border, is a region called the Darien Gap. And the reason it's called a gap is because it's the only area when you traverse the entirety of North and South America where there's no roads. There's tracks and paths and rivers, but there is no roads. It's a roadless jungle. And that might be of, kind of a geography trivia interest, except for the fact that hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens, or wannabe illegal aliens, headed to the U.S. border are crossing through the Darien Gap, which is causing problems, obviously, for people who are there, but also as an opportunity for us to use that as a choke point and work with Panama to try to limit the number of people coming through there. And the reason they're coming through is because Venezuelans, either from Venezuela or people who are living for many years in Colombia, are responding to the Biden administration's essentially an invitation to illegally move to the United States to come through the Darien Gap, and then also others from elsewhere in South America. Haitians who've been living for years in Chile or Colombia, as well as people flying in to Ecuador, which has very loose policies and pretty much lets anybody come in without a visa, make their way through the Darien Gap to get eventually to the U.S. border. So it's an extremely important strategic point for United States national security and border security. And because of that, my colleague Todd Bensman did a almost 2-week-long reporting trip to both sides, the Colombia and the Panama side of the Darien region. And he's joined us to talk about what he saw. If you go to our website, you'll see that we have a page devoted to his writing on this subject. He's published a number of things, both at our website and then also at various media outlets on what he's found there. We've published a report, kind of an overall report on what he saw and what it bodes for U.S. border security. And that's kind of what we want to talk about today. So Todd, thanks for joining us. If you could just start, what motivated this trip, what was this about, and what led you to go down there?
Right. Well, you said it well. The Darien Gap matters a lot to the United States in several areas, several policy areas. Chief among them is just the overall vast numbers that are coming in from 170 different countries, including countries of terrorism concern, all the nations of the Middle East. It's been reported quite often that we have logged somewhere on the order of 380 on the terror watch list who have actually reached our southern border. Well, a vast majority of them came through the Darien Gap. That's how they got here. It's a choke point. The reason I went there wasn't just because it's so important, but because Panama elected a new president, and the new president, Raul Jose Mulino, promised that the first order of business was he was going to shut the gap down. I'm going to close the Darien Gap. That's never happened before. No prior president of Panama was ever in the mood to do anything like that. Their policy has always been to just transit them all through as quickly as possible.
Just to interrupt, you've written about before, they call it controlled flow, where in the past they would come into Panama through the Darien Gap. Panama would put them on buses and send them to the Costa Rica border. Costa Rica would put them on their own buses and send them to the Nicaragua border. I mean, it's almost like, they were just moving this problem along for us to deal with when it got to the U.S. border. And that it is kind of remarkable that the new president, President Molino of Panama, was the first one to do this because, this is a little bit of a tangent, but we created Panama. And as part of the whole Panama Canal issue well over 100 years ago, and the idea that we couldn't apply, a little, wouldn't even take that much pressure, it seems to me, to get them to comply is remarkable. And then it's remarkable that the new president kind of had to make this decision almost on his own, despite U.S. policies.
Right. Panama moved them through.
Right.
On bus caravans. That was their official policy. The Biden administration fully embraced that policy. And not only did the White House, the Biden White House, Harris White House, fully embrace that spent quite a lot of effort over the last 2 years to create what had been kind of a sleepy country lane into a raging superhighway. Maybe 10,000 a year tops for decades, all of a sudden became 250,000 and then 550,000 last year.
This is coming through the Darien Gap.
Coming through the Darien Gap. And now all of a sudden the Panamanians decided to hit the brakes, hold the emergency brakes on it. So it's just extraordinary. I wanted to go down there, give them a couple of months, see how things are going, and go down there and assess this complete policy U-turn.
Right.
Complete reversal. It's important to note that Molino understood that he cannot do what he wanted to do alone. He had to have a few things. Chief among them was he needed the United States' support.
Right. Financial
support for repatriation flights. And they also needed the American diplomatic muscle to make the neighboring countries, which had similar policies to all of the above, move them through, Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Brazil, all of these different countries that were sending them the largest numbers through to get on board with this. And that's the way it was left when Molino took office on July 1st. Everybody, the Americans agreed. They signed an agreement that, if you read it, it looks a lot like, the Americans are, wow, what a great opportunity. We're going to help. We'll give you the money. We'll help you do this. And he took office on July 1 and went straight to work.
Okay, yeah, good. So, like you said, when he was inaugurated, actually DHS Secretary Mayorkas was down there. And so there did seem to be this commitment on our part to help Panama do what they had decided on their own they really very much wanted to do, because, 500,000 people coming through your country may not, it would be bad even for us, but this is a tiny little country, both geographically and in population. That's an enormous number of people. So the point is, they on their own decided, look, we need to stop this. We said we would help. Well, you went down there, a couple of months after the supposed agreements and such were signed. Was there any indication we were actually providing Panama the help they needed to protect themselves?
Yeah, well, first, briefly, the Panamanians had their own national security interest in doing this as well. They weren't doing it as a favor to us.
Sure.
That level of traffic was just absolutely crushing the Embera Indian tribe that was right in the pathway of it. The environmental degradation, the drownings, the dead people, the immigrants who were dying, the costs were astounding for the Panamanians. They couldn't really afford it either. They had good reason, their own good reasons to do it for themselves. But it just so happens that closing it would help U.S. national security and serve a lot of U.S. national interests.
Yeah, just to finish that thought, the only reason this is happening is because they know they have a chance to get into the United States. In other words, it's kind of the fallout of our policy that Panama is facing. So it makes perfect sense that they would want to somehow try to deal with this and that they would need our help to protect themselves.
Of course, they blame U.S. policy at our border, the Mexico border, for causing this mass rush through their country.
Right, which is self-evidently true. Obviously, they were correct in that.
Yeah, I mean, both countries, their interests perfectly dovetail. I mean, it's a golden opportunity. No prior Panamanian government had offered this, and what an opportunity for the United States to improve a lot of different problems, not the least of which is that, if you're running for election and you've got thousands of people crossing your border, it looks terrible and the polls are bad.
Right.
But anyway, your question was, how is it working? And in the first, 6 to 8 weeks, the Americans welched. They didn't come through with anything.
Mm-hmm.
The Panamanian government implemented a wide variety of preparatory they laid the groundwork. They poured the foundation for this thing. They wasted no time on Inauguration Day. They put up barbed wire about 5 kilometers worth on 3 of the 4 main trails through the Darien. They left one open that they could control, through which they could, apprehend those who would be good candidates for air flights home.
Right.
They began operations to shut down the smuggling organizations on both sides and start arresting both Panamanians and Colombians for the first time that were caught doing the smuggling.
Mm-hmm.
They could lay hands on guides or boat pilots. They were arresting them and seizing the boats. They closed off a couple of the sea routes using their naval assets. But if you really want to deter this, the Panamanians understood that it was going to take air repatriations just because of the geography of the situation. They're way out in the jungle. You can't just turn them back in the jungle.
Right.
It's that you have to send them somewhere by plane. And so air repatriation was the central tactic for the Molino government. And that's why they went to the Americans first and secured this agreement on July 1 to do that. The problem is that the Americans, for lack of a better word, welched.
Mm-hmm.
They suddenly there was no money. And when the repatriation flights did not materialize, the immigrants began to realize that they could get through. The
Right.
Panamanians were still pretty much letting them through. And when I was there, we were in the middle toward the end of a very significant lull in numbers on both sides coming through. It had fallen somewhere on the order of, 70 or 80%, mainly because the immigrants were waiting in place to see what the Panamanians would really do.
Right.
And so the numbers really dropped, but they were already on the upswing when I was there. I interviewed a lot of immigrants who said, well, the Panamanians are letting everybody through, so we're going. That's why I'm here. I came because, they say the border's closed, but it's not. I'm going. And that's what's happening as of this recording. The Americans really have not followed through.
Right.
They did pick up the tab on 1 or 2 flights. The Americans finally, they did put a flight or two, on the paid receipts, but those people that were on that flight were people that the Panamanians were already deporting for like a year now.
On their own tab, basically.
On their own tab.
Right.
Like they were criminal aliens. So it wasn't like a new category of non-criminals, which is what's needed. You have to deport regular immigrants who don't have criminal records if you really want to make an impact, and you have to do it in sufficient numbers.
Right.
That the odds are that they're not going to get in. They're going to get sent home on a plane, and all the money you paid to get here is down the tubes.
Right, right. So it was kind of interesting. Your first part of your trip down there was on the Colombia side. And I thought some of that was kind of interesting. If people, we'll have obviously the link in the show notes, but there's this bay on the Colombian side, and then you have to cross it, and you're still in Colombia briefly, but then that's sort of where the trails into the Darien start. And that you were talking about there's basically the flow is, there's nothing really impeding it there, and that there's actually these basically militia groups or gang or cartel or I don't know what you'd call it, but, an armed non-government group that's actually kind of in charge of transporting them across the bay and the kind of sending them on their way into the Darien. So what was going on there?
That's right. So the country of Colombia is a key partner in any plan to shut down the Darien Gap. You can't do it without the Colombians.
Sure, because half of it's in Colombia, basically.
Yeah, right. And on the Colombian side, there's diplomacy that's supposed to be going on to get Colombia to do a couple things. The first thing is, you want Colombia to accept expulsions of both Venezuelans who had been living there for years and years, and also their own people, Colombians, very large numbers who are passing through their territory, and you need them to accept large numbers.
Right.
And it's not in their interest to do that. Their interest is like Panama's interest and lots of other countries as long as they're moving through and don't bother us too much, that works for us. As long as the Americans are taking them and they're not staying here, that's great.
Get out by sundown and we're not going to hassle you, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So Colombia is absolutely key.
Mm-hmm.
But on the Colombian side, you have a constellation of legitimate and illegitimate entities, primarily the Gaitanistas, which is that they're better known as Clan de Golfo, the Gulf Clan. They are a paramilitary with 6,000 men under military arms that control this vast area abutting the Panamanian border. They're mainly cocaine traffickers and also human smugglers. They're making, on this particular mass migration crisis, they're really making bank. And so what I found was on that side, no interruption whatsoever, no impediments between the Colombian government, federal, state, and local, as well as the United Nations, many different organizations of the UN, and private nonprofit NGOs all working together throughout Gaitanista-controlled territory with their permission.
Interesting.
To move hundreds of thousands and if not millions through the territories that they control. All the immigrants, of course, have to pay to get on boats to cross into these towns and launch on the trails out. I visited all of these towns and interviewed many, many dozens of immigrants and actually met some of the Gaitanistas. They gave me permission to access some of their operations on both sides of the Uraba Gulf, which is where all this is happening,
right,
in Antioquia. There was no evidence whatsoever of federal government intervention in this. In fact, the federal migration officers of Colombia were right there stamping everybody through who were obviously immigrants. They're carrying backpacks with water jugs and tents and sleeping bags and sleeping pads and all manner. They're obviously going to the trailheads, and they would stamp them right onto the boats. And the small towns, Nicocli, for example, I visited a jump-off spot. You have to almost kind of see a map. We'll put the map in the show notes.
Right.
And also, these towns are fielding their own tax collectors at the docks. And every immigrant has to pay a small tax to get on the boat over. They have to also pay the gaitanistas $175 a head before they pay the actual ferry boat cost, which is, $20 or something one way.
So everybody's getting their piece of the action, basically.
Everybody's involved. The United Nations is operating inside a gaitanista camp that they control entirely. Colombian banks are operating on the inside of camps that the gaitanistas control access to, and by force of by arms. So everybody is in on this. The federal government, the municipal governments, the NGOs, the United Nations, and the gaitanistas are operating in the open, in and all around all of them. There is absolutely no question that there is widespread awareness that they're all integrated partnership, and I call it a marriage.
Right.
They're all married for this one goal, and the Colombians had done nothing whatsoever to stop any of it, while the Panamanians are trying their best on their own unilaterally to have some diplomacy with the Colombians to shut that down. And they were expecting the Americans, the State Department, to get in there and really kind of twist some arms to make the Colombians actually do something different. So without the Americans and without the Colombians, at the very least, they're essential partners in closing the gap. Everybody who went through the gap was getting right through and onto the buses for controlled flow all the way through. The Panamanians were quite frustrated at this.
Interesting. And when you were down there, you got a exclusive interview. I think it was the first time any U.S. source has sat down and spoken with the head of Panama's own border patrol, basically. It's border police called Senafront. What did the head of Panama's border police tell you about what's going on at their side?
Right. The Senafront Director General, his name is Jorge Gobea. He's a holdover from the last Panamanian administration. He is not a political, although, of course, those guys are always political. But, he's there because he knows what he's doing. He's been doing it a long time. Senafront, of course, is Panama's crack frontier border guard. They're actually well-respected, well-trained. They're also well-equipped. Mm-hmm. And they are all over the Panamanian side of the jungle. And what he told me was that, we've been closing these trails down. We're blocking trails in anticipation of channeling most of the flow to one spot so that we can remove our men from this vast area into one area and process people in, including a lot of them for detention and deportation by air. That was the plan.
Right.
And also go after the gaitanistas on both sides and start doing arrests and that kind of interdiction. And he pretty much admitted that, this is early on. They took office July 1, and I was visiting about 5 weeks later.
Right.
And he explained what they had done, what they were doing, the trail closures. They're doing quite a lot of marine interdiction, apprehending immigrants on the boats at sea on the Pacific and the Caribbean side, both sides.
Basically taking boats kind of around the Darien Gap?
Yes.
Yeah, interesting.
There's always been some of that. And then, if you're closing trails, they expected to have more of that. So they've got a lot of that. But then what do you do with the immigrants that you arrest?
Right.
Well, you can't deport them because the Americans haven't really followed through.
Mm-hmm.
So they're just letting everybody go,
right.
just like always. And he admits this. We're just not in a position to do anything, especially when the numbers start climbing. We can't. Colombia takes one flight a week to Medellin.
Right.
And that's about it. And we need, dozens of flights a week to really make
that
a dent.
One flight a week, it's not even really a drop in the bucket. I mean, it's almost like, what's the point to that? The interesting thing, and you wrote a separate piece about this in interviewing the head of the Panamanian border police, was that they also, they were doing screening for people, special interest aliens, as the terminology goes. There's people from, especially those from Islamic countries where there's widespread terrorist group activity, and that the numbers have gotten so large they can't actually screen all that many people anymore. So what did he tell you about that issue?
Right. Well, of course, naturally, I asked him about, Islamic terrorists and, what they did with them. And there had just been a news story that they caught 3 Afghanistan immigrants who were on the FBI's terrorism watch list, and they pulled them off the trails. And that had been a fairly recent news story. And I was asking him if he could elaborate on that. They published it. They put video out of these guys wearing hoods.
Right.
With Cinefront guys on either side. I mean, this was a real terrorist bust. And his response was, well, we actually do this all the time. We have story after story like that. We do quite a lot. But that was happening a lot more when the numbers were 10,000 or less crossing through in a whole year.
Right. In other words, they had the bandwidth to actually pull people out and check who they were.
Exactly. And he really surprised me when he said, but in this day and age with these numbers in the last few years, we're lucky if we can get 3%. And when the numbers are really high, we might be able to screen 1%.
Right.
And so we know for a fact that they're getting through. A lot of them are getting through. And this provided the first explanation for why at the American border, we are getting historic numbers of people on the FBI terrorism watch list. This shows that the Panamanians had been catching them way down there before they ever got even to Mexico.
Well, there were probably fewer coming to begin with, just because Biden, catch and release policies hadn't created the new flow. But you're right.
That's true.
Because of the huge increase in numbers, Panama's ability to serve as a kind of first filter or screen against those guys is dramatically reduced, because they can only check, a handful of people given the enormous flows coming through the Darien.
Yeah, I mean, and the director general said, we have to move them through. We can't just, they pile up.
Right.
In our territory, we just can't check everybody when the numbers are like this. Nor have we been checking people.
Yep. Interesting.
I interviewed a former American ICE officer down there who's still down there. He worked in the Panamanian embassy, and he said we were checking 90%, collecting the biometrics of 90% of everybody who crossed up until 2021, and then we just had to give up. We had to throw our hands up. I mean, nobody could do it. He said the way he put it was, checking and collecting biometrics on all of those people was just, quote unquote, insurmountable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. In other examples, the term is often used, they call it line flushing, where if the line, wherever it is, at an airport, at a border crossing, whatever it is, if the line gets too long, often what you'll see is a decision to not screen anybody, let a whole bunch through, basically to make the line go away, rather than to maintain the standards of screening. Because, in Panama's case here, they have no choice. They've got nothing. They have we're not helping them out sufficiently. and they can't, keep the people there, and they don't want to stay there anyway. It was an interesting quote you got from the head of Centerfront, where he said people don't want to stay, they don't want to live in Panama. They want to keep going to the United States, which is obviously true. So what are the prospects that the United States will actually live up to these commitments we made to Panama to help them protect their own country? Is this likely to change with a new administration?
Well, the first thing that people need to understand, in my view, is what the Biden-Harris administration's policy has been about the Darien Gap up until uncomfortably, probably for the Biden-Harris administration. Something unexpected happened. Quite unexpected happened. They ended up with a Panamanian president that wants to close it all down.
Right.
And that's like the equivalent of, the Biden-Harris administration had been working for 2 or 3 years now on building this Lego edifice, this big fancy Lego thing, these policies down there that turned what had been a country lane into the super highway. They shortened it. They, created more camps, hospitality camps. They surged cash into the United Nations agencies down there, doing, alternative pathways, lawful pathways, really just made a 7 or 10 day terrible trek into like a 2-day, couple night camping trip.
Through the Darien. In other words, in a sense, what we've done is with taxpayer money made it less difficult to illegally cross through the Darien Gap. I mean, it's the opposite of deterrence. It's actually facilitating the border crisis because these people are all headed to the Mexican border.
Right. And so, Molina essentially asked, first of all, he became this guy who was like, the giant smashing through all the big Lego edifices that they built, and asked the Mayorkas DHS to join in and just smash it all down. And of course, what we're seeing now is resistance. The Americans don't seem to be very eager to smash all the stuff that they built up.
I mean, essentially, what you're saying is that the president of Panama is more interested in controlling the U.S. border than the U.S. administration is.
Yes. And they say so. I mean, interestingly, the president of Panama is holding press conferences complaining about, like, where are the Americans? We're doing this for you. Like, right. Why wouldn't you come in here and help us tear it all down and shut it down? And he's held a number of press conferences saying, where's the money? Where's the beef?
Right.
There isn't any. And that's extraordinary that they would have to do this, because a White House that has this opportunity to control a national security threat like this, where you have Afghanis, getting pulled off the line by luck, who are on the watch list, and, hundreds of others as well.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a chance to close that down or limit it or make it harder, and you don't do it. It's just stunning. Like, normal people don't understand. And I think what we're seeing manifested by the Panamanian president right now with these press conferences is like, how could you be doing this? We're doing this for you.
Right.
This is a U.S. interest.
Right.
And where are you?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's it looks like, depending on how the election in November goes, there might be two very different approaches to this. And so it might be interesting. I mean, we'll see, but it might be interesting to go down, say, after inauguration next year, depending on who gets inaugurated, and see, what the situation is at the time. I'm not making a commitment that I'm going to pay for the airfare right now, but it seems like that would be a useful follow-up, because your trip so far has really kind of laid the groundwork for what's going on down there. And it'll be interesting to see if and how any of this changes because of political developments over the next couple of months.
Right, because, there are two things that are needed that the Panamanians want. They need American diplomatic muscle on
Right.
Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, which has an open skies policy, a visa-free policy where, hundreds of thousands land, all the 60,000 Chinese have come in through there, and they're identifying Ecuador as a target for diplomacy. You've got to end the open skies policy.
Right.
And Colombia, they need that diplomacy, and they don't have the muscle on their own to get that done. We saw the Colombians just blow the whole thing off. It's business as usual as far as I could say.
Right. I mean, my sense is, look, if you're a superpower, it seems to me one of the places you would want to throw a little weight around would be to try to protect your own border. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. We have the U.S. government complaining about, I don't know, what the government in Myanmar is doing, and yet we're not applying any pressure to Colombia to essentially limit illegal immigration in their country so that there's less of it that ends up at the U.S. border.
Of course.
So anyway, what they need is our diplomatic help. And then number two is what? Obviously money, right?
Right. They need money, and they could sure use some ICE air flights as well, some air assets,
right,
to do this in earnest, to really help start flying people back to their countries after the diplomacy is done. Those two things are what's needed. And those are the two things that the Panamanians so far are not getting. So they're hanging out there all by themselves.
Right.
They set this whole thing up. It's maybe a little bit embarrassing for them that they did this, and the Americans aren't so far following through. Now, it's possible that the Americans could change their minds. I don't think that the Biden-Harris administration is going to change its mind on this. If you read the agreement that was signed between the two countries, you start to see things in there. For example, the Americans wrote into the agreement that we're willing to do repatriation flights for the Panamanians, but only after we run the people who would get on those flights through protection vetting.
Right.
In other words, if we can't find a way to get them into the United States on one of our lawful pathway programs, maybe we might end up putting them. I mean, it's like a last resort that we would put anybody on one of these planes.
Yeah, no, it really is unbelievable, because basically what they're saying is that they have to check to see whether they would qualify for any of the, frankly, legally dubious programs that Biden has set up. Only if they don't, and only if they agree to go home, would we fund for repatriation flights. So, I mean, it's almost, honestly, it's almost meaningless the way it's worded now.
Right. It was clever because it looked like the Americans were doing what any reasonable, normal person would expect them to do in a situation like this. Oh, yeah, of course, here's an agreement. We're going for it. We're with you. But then there's the fine print, it's like the fast paced on an advertisement, where they're talking about all the outs and loopholes,
right,
and liability and stuff in a really quick way. For example, it didn't emerge until after the agreement signed in the Washington Post. It took that the Americans were only giving $6 million initially for this thing, which is, in that kind of an operation, I don't know how long that would last, but not very long.
Yeah, it's peanuts.
$6 million.
Yeah.
And then this whole thing that they never even announced, it was Molina who announced it, said, the Americans are telling me that they won't let anybody on that plane unless they want to be on the plane. They volunteer to be on the plane. There's some unique circumstance in their life where they had second thoughts and now they need to get back, or, mom got sick back in Bogota or whatever. They got to get back. I mean, none of that rises to the threshold of real deterrence.
Right.
And so the immigrants are on their way. They're coming through.
Yeah, the agreement with Panama that the Biden-Harris administration penned basically seems to me political kabuki. So they can say, look, we're doing something about this, when in fact it does nothing. It's status quo.
Right. And the fact of the matter is that, the Panamanian government, the new one, is they're complaining. They keep complaining, but they're not getting any press about this. It looks like a double cross. I mean, really, it just looks like, hey, you guys go out there and do your best, but, good luck out there on your own.
I mean, it's a similar kind of thing with our agreement with Mexico. It's not exactly the same thing, but basically what it amounts to is the Biden-Harris administration is unwilling to enforce U.S. immigration laws, so they kind of hope that other countries will do it for us. And that's not the way things work. Countries will cooperate with us if, toward the same shared objective. But the idea that we can just fob off enforcement of immigration law with all kinds of caveats and restrictions and limitations, and somehow that's going to fix things is surreal. So, Todd, we're out of time here. I appreciate your coming on. Obviously, the full report is going to be on our website with various other things that you've written on this. There's a lot coming out, as well as some videos from your reporting trip down to Colombia and Panama and the border area down there in the Darien Gap. There will be more to say and to write about this, especially after inauguration, however things turn out in November. Presumably there'll be some new developments and some new news down there, especially starting in January. And so I know you'll be following it, and we'll see whether more reporting down there is warranted. But in the meantime, thanks for coming on and filling us in on this important situation.
That's right. Thank you. Yeah, very interesting situation down there. I think it really is all going to come down to who wins the November 5 election. I think a Harris administration is going to back the status quo. And I think a Trump administration will probably flood the zone with cash and diplomacy and anything they need. So it's going to go one way or the other.
Right. And we will keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, thanks for coming on, and keep up your good work.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Todd. And it was really important for us to get this report from what's going on in Panama, which is frankly pretty important to America's security and America's immigration control, even though it's a couple thousand miles from our border. And that's it for this week's episode of Parsing Immigration Policy. Thanks for listening. Thanks to our multi-talented producer, Brian Griffith. And if you have any suggestions, compliments, complaints, anything, feel free to just email us at center@cis.org. And if the podcasting platform you get this on allows you to rate or review, please do that, because that's the only way to stand out from the thousands of podcasts that are out there. So until next week, this is Mark Krikorian with Center for Immigration Studies signing off.